to get started, I briefly want to talk about studying in general, just because people ask about this all the time throughout the class, and it might help to give you the framework now. If you have questions about this later, of course, that's no problem, but let's just talk about the 4 ways you can study, and then figure out the pros and cons to each one, so you can kind of become, you know, the owner of your LSAT future. Right? Now, I'm going to tell you, oh, here's some homework stuff that I would do or I would suggest doing, but the reality is you got to figure out where you're at and the best way to use your time, because everybody's at a different place. Like, when you're scoring really high on the test, you review tests differently than if you're scoring really low. Right? Just the things that you can do, the amount of time you spend reviewing is about the same, depending on where you're scoring, but you're going to do a lot of different things. Okay, anyways, well, there are 4 ways to study. One, I'll just call it T. It's kind of like a logic game. It's reviewing theory and stuff like that, right? Like, oh, okay, there are 18 different question types out there. There's strengthened questions, there are weakened questions, there are flaw questions, there are ordering games, there are grouping games, and you get familiar with the structure of the test, right? There's also drilling, which is basically doing one problem at a time and trying to do your best with that problem and then go into another problem, right? Then there are timed sections, which is basically doing a 35-minute timed section and then making mistakes and learning from that. Now, for some of us, we may have accommodations, and so that'd be 53 minutes or 70 minutes, depending on your accommodation. And then there are timed tests. Okay? Now, that's it. Those are the 4 key ways to study. People have other stuff that they suggest out there. They're like, oh, why don't you go read The Economist or something like that? Yeah, you could do that, but these things are a lot more effective, right? Now, they all have their pros and cons. Theory may make you feel good, like, oh, I have an awareness of the structure of the test. We're doing theory right now. I'm just telling you how this stuff works. You're not actually doing it, right? And so it does have its place, but the reality is, until you take an idea and try to put it into practice, it's kind of useless, and you may not even understand it until you try to do it. So we're going to try to keep our discussion of theory or how things work to a minimum and just jump into examples, and then as we're going through an example, talk about the theory, and it makes a lot more sense. Like, oh, okay, I can see how this applies once I have an example in front of me, right? Drilling is basically doing examples. So we're going to do a lot of this in class. Oh, okay, do this game, and then we're going to talk about it. Do a game, and then we're going to talk about it. The nice thing about drilling is it makes it really easy for you to learn from your mistakes, right? Because you're just doing one problem, and then you're dissecting it. You're also not usually under time pressure, because it's very hard to say, oh, let's do a game now. I'm going to give you 8 minutes and 45 seconds. If you take 35 minutes and divide it by 4, that's 8:45. So in theory, you should have 8 minutes and 45 seconds for each game, but that's not how the test works. You really have to do some games in like 5 or 6 minutes and other games in like 11, 12, 13 minutes. And so when you're doing one-off games, it doesn't make sense to time yourself or to like set a goal, because you don't know how long it should necessarily take, and you really shouldn't worry about that. Instead, what you should be worrying about is, how do I approach this game effectively? How do I get it right? And once you can start getting it right, then start worrying about going fast, right? And so drilling really allows you to focus on getting things right. The other thing that's nice about drilling, and we're going to do the vast majority of our drilling in the LSAT Demon. The LSAT Demon is just an online tool that allows you to do practice problems one at a time, is that the Demon will give you questions that are targeted at your skill level, right? And so once you do 5 or 6 questions in the Demon, it'll pretty much be at your difficulty level, and that's where you should be spending your time, right? If you suck at logical reasoning, then spending your time on difficulty 3 or 4 or 5 questions, 5 is the hardest, is not necessarily a good use of your time. You should be doing 1s and 2s until you understand them and are getting them right, and then you should start going up to 3s and 4s and eventually up to 5s, right? So drilling allows you to spend the vast majority of your time at your skill level. If you're doing very well in logical reasoning, it's a waste of time to do easy questions, right? You should be focusing on harder ones. So drilling is very effective because it's targeted at your skill level, right? You're not wasting your time on anything that's too easy or too hard. And you get immediate feedback, right? You get something wrong and you're like, okay, I got it wrong. Let's figure out how I got it wrong. And you learn from that. So of all these things up here, this is probably my most preferred. But that's not to say that you should then go and just drill for the rest of your life. Because although it's probably more effective than the other three ways of preparing, it has its downsides. One is that when you get into a time section and you have the timer going and you're all stressed out about that, you can make mistakes that have nothing to do with your underlying skills, right? And so you don't get to practice that when you're drilling. So doing time sections allows you to, okay, how do I deal with the fact that there's a timer ticking? How do I ignore that? How do I deal with the fact that I'm not finishing the section? That alone stresses people out, right? They get to question 15 and the timer's up and they're like, oh, this is a total failure, blah, blah, blah. Not necessarily. We want to get to a point where you're getting 14 out of 15, 15 out of 15, and then try to do 16 or 17 questions. So this is getting a lot closer to the actual testing environment, and so there's a lot of value in doing time sections and getting used to working in 35-minute blocks or 53-minute blocks or whatever your time constraint is. But the downside to this, and this is what I was just talking about with drilling, is that when you do a time section, they're testing all skill levels, right? So the first half of the time section is mostly difficulties 1 and 2. And then you have a bunch of 3s and so in the middle, and then you have 4s and 5s at the end. Now it's a little scattered throughout, but it roughly goes from easier to harder. So if you do a time section, you just spent 35 minutes of your life, half of those questions are going to be too easy for you. You're going to get them right no matter what happens. If you never studied them and you just showed up on test day, you get them right. And a lot of these questions, they're beyond where you're at right now. So of these 35 minutes, maybe 15 of them was well-used time in terms of testing and pushing your skill level further, right? But you have to practice within the time frame. So it's like you want to do a mix of drilling and time sections. But keep in mind, when you're done with a time section, there can be anywhere from 2 to 4 questions that you need to review because you're doing very well, or maybe 10 to 15 questions because you're not doing so well. And there's questions you didn't get to, there's questions you got wrong, but you just don't understand at all, right? So unlike drilling, where you're doing a question and immediately reviewing it, in time sections, it's like, okay, you're going to finish that 35-minute section. Now you need to go back and finish questions you didn't get to. You got to go and review questions that you got wrong. And you probably should review questions that you weren't sure about, right? Like you might do a question and be oscillating between 2 answers, pick the right one, and never come back to it because you're just so concerned about all the questions you got wrong. But really, there was something to learn from that question. You just don't ever get around to learning from it, right? Like you would if you were doing drilling. Because drilling, every time you do a question, it's like you got to grapple with whether you got it right or wrong and whether or not you felt good about the answer you chose, even if you got it right. So anyways, in time sections, there's some downsides. Now, time tests is the worst because you do 5 sections. No one wants to review a test after 5 sections of test taking, right? And so then what happens? They review it the next day. And when they're reviewing it the next day, they're like, I don't know why I chose D. Who knows what I was thinking at the time? And so at the moment you're reviewing it, you're like, well, C makes a lot of sense, moving on. So it's really hard to like learn from your mistakes. It's not to say you can't, you definitely can. And there's a lot to do there. And you have to do this because if all you ever do is time sections, when you show up on test day and do 5 sections back to back, you're gonna be like, dang, that was exhausting, right? So we have to do all of these things, but in terms of a hierarchy, I'd probably say least amount of this, maybe 5% of this, 50% of this, and then probably something like 30, 15. Let's hope that adds up to 100. Does that add up to 100? No, it does not, does it?
It does.
Yeah, it does! Oh, good. Okay, got nervous there for a second. These are all rough numbers anyway, but I would say that this is how you want to allocate your time. Now this actually changes too. When you first start studying, you want even more of this, and maybe even a little bit more of this, right? Because you're just like, okay, what's going on? But once you start to get better and better, and you get fewer wrong in a time section, the more it makes sense to spend your time doing time sections and even doing time tests. So bottom line, the course is trying to match this to some degree. You know, we do time tests most weekends. At the beginning, not as many, but then we'll start doing them every weekend. Time sections, this is something you'll want to do on your own, and you can do those in the Demon. You just go into lsatdemon.com and then click on time sections and just start doing them. And to keep this simple, you can start at like test 52. Just start at test 52 and start going up. There's so many tests in there. It doesn't make sense to do the old ones because you can use those for drilling. Your drilling actually should be set by default to pull from test 1 to 44, 1 to 41. And I would just leave it. Just leave it at that range because you're never going to do these tests as time sections or time tests. So if you do all your drilling from these tests, then it won't overlap with anything you end up doing, you know, for practice outside of that. Okay? And then what usually happens with theory is that as you're doing these three things, you start to get a sense of things that you just do not like, right? I hate necessary assumption questions, or I hate flaw questions, or I hate reading column passages that are on science, or whatever. And then, based on what you hate, you go back and you find videos, or you ask me, about those topics, and you dig into them a little bit more, right? So a lot of times people want to like start here and just get a whole, like go through everything. It's better to go in and start like making mistakes and then be like, oh yeah, I'm not very good at this stuff, and then go back and learn a little bit more about that, and then jump back into drilling. Okay? So that's LSAT preparation in a nutshell. When in doubt, just start doing this. A good default plan, we could just talk about right now, is to basically plan on drilling most of the time, and then every other day or so do one time section. So you can take the stuff that you've been doing and learning and drilling and try to put it into a timed context. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Yes?
Does the Demon take time into factoring its kind of AI and putting you at a skill level?
Yes, it does take. It doesn't tell you what your time is, but it does take it into account.
Okay.
Yeah. One other thing. Let's see what I was going to say. Oh yeah, when it comes to studying, it's way more effective to study a little bit every day than it is to study a lot all at once and then not study for a while. So if you think about your life and you're like, hey, I can study 15, 30 minutes every day, and then maybe 3 days a week I can do 2 hours or something like that, go for it. Like, find some amount of time that you can do every day, if that's 15 minutes, if that's 30 minutes, whatever, and just like set aside that time and go study. Because even if you just drill for like 15 minutes, at least you're like getting into the LSAT, you get a question wrong, you learn from it, and then maybe you have to go on to something else in your life. But it's like you're staying in touch with the test as opposed to just trying to cram everything on the weekend or whatever, and then there's just power in like keep coming back to it, right? It's like working out every day as opposed to working out once a week or something like that. All right, and last thought on that note, if you schedule a time, like how many people here use Google Calendar or something like that? If you don't use a calendar, how many people don't use a calendar at all? Okay, how do you schedule your life?
I don't.
You don't schedule your life. I'm assuming you have a schedule.
I don't.
You don't have. Do you have a job?
Remember the things I have to do.
Just remember the things you have to do.
Yeah.
Do you go to work?
I do go to work.
Okay, so that's a schedule, right, in your head, and you get back at a certain time, right? What time do you typically get back from work?
Depends, but around 4 or 5.
Oh, that's nice. A little earlier. Okay, cool. Well, anyway, so what I would say is, if you think about your evening, and you're like, okay, I'm going to make sure to do 15 or 30 minutes ideally every day, then what time can you do that? Is it always 6? Then schedule that, right? If you don't have a calendar, at least in your mind, be like, okay, 6 is when I'm going to do LSAT. Because what ends up happening is like when other things start to come up later in the week, right? Someone's like, oh, hey, let's go do this or let's do that. You think, just wait, hold on. I can do that a little bit later. Like you're mentally already blocking out that time, and it's going to dramatically increase how frequently you end up studying. If you just let it happen when it happens, right? You're like, okay, I remember I got to do 30 minutes every day. There's so many days where you're going to get to the end of the day, you're like, oh shit, I didn't do that. And it's like, oh, I'm too tired, I'm going to bed. Right? But if you plan ahead, your chances of it happening just skyrocket. So even just right now, just think to yourself, okay, on Mondays I'm going to do it this time, Tuesdays I'm going to do it this time. Ideally it's the same time every day, because then it just becomes very simple. But some of us, our lives are more complicated than that. So whatever it is, just say, hey, look, I have an hour here, I have a half hour here, and then just try to make that a habit. And that's where the progress really comes from, is focusing on just learning one thing every day. Now, hopefully you learn like 4 or 5. But if you just say, every day I got to learn one LSAT thing, you're going to see a progress in your score. Okay, cool. Any other questions on any of that? Does everybody have a time in their mind? I was just chatting there. Anyone write? How many people wrote down times? Okay, what do you got?
6 p.m.
6 p.m. Okay, not a bad time. So every day at 6, you're just going to do this. That's nice. It can be the same time. Okay, weekends, same time?
Well, I guess we'll have class on Saturdays.
Class on
So
Saturday.
on Sundays, I'll probably do it after I go grocery shopping. So I'll get
Okay.
11.
Look at all this. You got to fit it into the practical side of our life, right? But that's what you want to do. Okay, good.